Hi, Ken. Thanks for joining us.
You. See if I can get my video going here.
Sounds good. I just tell him we've got, oh, and there's Chairman Teskey. Hi, Andrew. Oh, and Andrea. Perfect.
Hi there.
Great. Well, it looks like we've got nearly everyone that we've heard from again. Chairman Teskey, I did hear from Christian a few days ago that she was going to be unable to attend. I have not heard from George, but hopefully he'll be able to join us here today as well. The Chairman, I'll look to you. We've got one topic to cover today. If you're ready to start, we are all ready to jump in.
I am ready to go. Let's do it.
Excellent. So before I apologize for my clunkiness and getting through a screen share here, I just want to give you a little bit of a summary of what I hope to get you all through from a discussion point and as well as a content point. So I think we have at this point discussed fairly thoroughly the cultivation and the manufactured products component. So I want to spend some time towards the end of the meeting kind of making sure that we've captured your guys' thoughts and directions on those two marijuana related businesses. And at the beginning, I want to spend some time going back through and discussing the retail sales component. There were, as we refreshed on our notes and past conversations and directions from you, really think there's kind of two options that are starting to take form. And so we've gone through the effort of putting them exactly as that kind of an option one and an option two, and really want you guys to give some guidance and some direction on which of the two you think best align with where your recommendation would be on this type of use. And so we've got some slides, some new maps that reflect kind of that option A and option B. And then we really, I think, left off last time with some conversation about some use specific standards and how far down that path you all think you might want to go. So we're prepared to talk a fair bit about those. I think we had some preliminary conversations last time, for example, about hours of operation. We certainly talked about signage. I've spent some time with our legal counsel here regarding signage and sign regulations, and certainly Jamie Beard can join in on that topic as well. So those are really the three, I guess, two topics I wanted to cover. And then there's a couple just outstanding comments that maybe don't directly align with one of the specific uses, but some overarching questions that feel like they will add and be additive to the ultimate direction from the Planning Commission. So with that, let me pause there and see if I'm missing anything. And if not, I will jump into some slides.
I don't think you're missing anything. That sounds like where we were last time, and we can go forward from here.
Sure. That sounds great. Can everybody see my slides? I'm seeing heads nod. Awesome. So, so as I indicated, maybe a little bit of refresher, although I think you guys are probably really well versed on it and probably would be remiss to not apologize for you having to work with me leading you through these versus Lance. Lance has been very astute and I think that's very agile in leading you guys through this conversation. He is taking some much needed time off this week. So unfortunately you're left with me. That said, let's jump back in. The three primary license types that I always like to start here again are our sales, cultivation, and products manufacture. Like I said, I think we've done a fair bit of conversation. I'm certainly seeing some consensus shape around the latter two, which really, I think for the purpose of today, leaves us with talking about the two options as I kind of referenced on the use for the retail stores. So retail sales stores, whatever we want to refer to them, really the place where people walk in a storefront and buy product and then leave. So I think probably the easiest way to summarize, I think, is kind of an option A, or kind of at the bottom here, you'll see map 1, and it references a specific map. Is there was a fair bit of conversation here at the Planning Commission about looking at retail sales as any other sales, retail sales use. And really, I think akin in many people's minds here on the Planning Commission has expressed that it would kind of act in be similar to and akin to liquor sales. And so what that means is all those uses, if we were to treat it similarly, would be in the same zone districts. So that would be a B1, B2, C1, C2, MU, BP, and all of our MX zone districts. And granted, there aren't actually very many properties zoned MX, but there are a handful scattered in the community. That would also relate to or provide buffers from schools. The current standard at the state level is that you buffer 500 feet, and that is both from your traditional kind of D51 school here in the Valley. It also buffers from parochial schools. So I think that question came up last time about the buffering from church-related schools, and that is included in the liquor licensing standards. And then lastly, from universities. And it's actually the main campus of the university is how that is established in the liquor licensing and from regulations. So that would be the 500 feet standard. And then we talked about some use specific standards as well related to signage, odors, and hours of operation. And I think there was kind of a train of thought on the hours that they should mirror the states, and the states, just as you as a matter of information, is an 8 a.m. to a midnight operation. We certainly at a local level have the ability to make that more restrictive or less restrictive. So that is the standard there. Let me actually correct that. We have the ability to make it more restrictive, not less. Thank you. So that's kind of option A, map 1, and I'll show you map 1 that reflects that here in a minute. We can kind of vacillate between the two as needed. The second column was, I think, taking a bit more of a restrictive approach to marijuana sales and recognizing that it functions similar to liquor license, but not necessarily the same as. And the conversation I think that we heard and want to make sure that we've captured it correctly is that we would look at some additional limitations to zoning. So I believe what was discussed was the B2, which is actually the downtown area predominantly, C1, C2, again, some of our major corridors, certainly North Avenue and 650 are the predominant corridors for those zone districts, as well as MX. And again, there's a couple.
Yes, honey, I don't
Sprinkling
know. I
of those,
gotta go
not many.
back to try to get it on the.
So there was also some additional buffers. And Sam and Lois, just if you guys wouldn't mind turning yourselves on mute there, that'd be great. Oh, looks like you did. So the other conversation here, I think that largely shapes the difference is the type of buffering. I think we heard some conversation about potentially looking at some larger buffering from schools, assuming they are all the same school types as liquor licensing, but perhaps a larger buffer and then some buffers between stores as well. So up to 3,000 square or lineal feet, I believe is what was kind of talked as one of the maximums or concepts in that category. And then again, a set of use specific standards, and we can talk through those here after. So the use table expert, if you went with kind of an option 1, again, this is how retail sales is shows up in our code today. So again, B1, B2, C1, C2, MU, BP, and then the MX categories are also allowed. And here then are the resulting maps. So this is again the buffering map. I will say that this may not be the exact map. We did do a cursory comb through of all of our parochial schools, but we certainly want to verify that before solidifying this map. So just know that this might not be 100%, but it's starting to get really close. So this map, again, shows that sales really areas where liquor is allowed today to be sold. Again, all of our kind of 6 and 50 corridor, North Avenue, obviously there's some areas here from Grand Junction High School, as well as the CMU school that really play that. There's obviously a couple parochial schools there, I think on about 11th and Hill, give or take. So that's kind of map one. That's what it would look like as far as locations and zoning areas in which a store can locate. And then map two is not altogether different. Again, predominantly C1, C2, and B2 are really the main drivers. Those are the big zoning districts that have lots of properties within them. So you'll see some pretty minor changes, but not a lot. We haven't gone through the exercise here of what Lance had called that kind of fish netting to kind of actually place different sites here. But again, that buffer between facilities or retail stores could certainly be incorporated into either or both of these scenarios. So let me stop there. To me, I think the kind of decision point for Planning Commission is, do either one of these capture kind of the consensus thought from Planning Commission, or are there tweaks to one or either of them that would better reflect that consensus?
Well, this is Keith, and I might add that this seems to fit the conversations that we've had before about looking at whether or not we look at it like, liquor sales and not try to, be too restrictive on just defining certain specific areas and everything else. So the maps, I think, generally look like what we've talked about in the past. And I'm wondering if it's not now, when is a good time to talk about how the land use and the maps coincide with what any type of number of stores limitations look like? And more importantly, at that time, understanding once those licenses are issued, how is the the buffering between stores kind of fit into that conversation? Because the one thing that we've heard from discussions throughout the community is that there isn't a strong desire to have a red light district, or in this case, a green light district where they get clustered down. And we think we've looked at a lot of these things and in prior discussions sort of thought about, well, how we don't necessarily want to just predetermine where these things can be in any given part of town. And so we've reduced back the buffering and the zoning and looked at that. But if that's still an element that we want to talk to, and maybe my comment turns into more of a question of, when do we talk about how the selection process impacts the land use from the perspective of how do we make sure we don't end up with all the stores in one area? Right, because ultimately, just to review on that, the selection process is if we go through some sort of selection process and they have to predetermine their location, and they're stuck with that location, after the selection process, well, then you may end up with a scenario where the decision makers have to decide, well, we like this business and this approach from a merits or a points-based standpoint. And so we're going to go with them, but they might have been the ones unable to select maybe the best, I'm kind of air quoting when I say the best locations. And so you're stuck with what's left over. I'll leave it at that. That's my wonder on how do we take these maps that give a lot of open area, and we've talked about the corridors, we've talked about how to not make them sure they're not all clustered in one area. We didn't want to restrict them too much with a land use approach, so we looked at it in these two ways. But now is it time to start talking about how this decision starts to have some real weight put towards it on needing to know more about what that selection process for a limited number of stores would be. Does that make sense? I feel like I rambled a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does. And Chairman Tuskey, if I can add, I think one of the premises of this approach to either kind of this option A or option B, as we discussed 2 weeks ago, or not quite 2 weeks ago, was really that there would be a cap. And so that is actually on my list of elements that I'd like to talk with you guys about is, what is the range of that cap that you would feel comfortable with this approach? For example, and the numbers can certainly vary here. Is it if the city continues 10 or fewer licenses, this is the land use regime that you would recommend, or is that under 20, or is it 5 and under? So I think there is some relationship. This came up obviously at length in the last workshop with you all, is that this kind of paradigm for a recommendation is really structured upon there being some understanding that the council is looking towards a numerical cap. And so again, the follow-up then I think is, well, how many stores, and after that threshold would you recommend looking at some of these kind of spatial elements or even the zoning elements? So I think, Keith, hopefully that's a summary, and we certainly jump to that. In my mind, it might be easier to say, kind of this option A or option B, is there a preference there? And then let's understand as a group what that threshold is. Again, is there a number of stores, a dozen or fewer, that, as long as there's a numerical cap, this structure works for you all?
So Tamara, can I ask a general question? What is the intent of the buffering? For I mean, I kind of get it from store to store, but I think Keith pointed out the problem that they had in Palisade when you try to do that to try and prevent them from clustering. But like from schools, I mean, I can imagine what the intent is behind that, but I think that will help us choose which way to go to make sure that we're achieving and working towards the intent that instead of it just being so arbitrary, because it appears in some ways to be arbitrary. Should we do 5,000, 500, 1,000, these numbers? So what's the intent?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and thank you for answering that. I will provide what I think kind of my personal, maybe or professional interpretation is. I think it can be construed in a variety of different ways, but I believe that on the liquor components, especially that 500 feet is really driven from exposure to minors. So reducing that exposure. And I think that same intent would carry over here. The state clearly, and we'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about signage, it wants to make sure that there's not advertising or exposure to minors. And that is clear on the sign agenda. And I would expect that would certainly influence the perception and the intent behind the bufferings herein. But I will certainly let other people join in. There may be additional reason or rationale that you think buffering may be appropriate or not.
I mean, if there's a point where you make it, especially with the distances from other stores, and for people, property owners or potential business people who want to open a store looking for properties, there's so many other things you deal with, as with parking and access, and just simply maybe a building that is too costly to redo or rehab, and just finding those properties can be so difficult to begin with. The more we limit it, the harder it's going to be for people to open these businesses, which maybe is fine, but I just think we need to be upfront about that. You know what I mean?
I think those are great comments, and certainly welcome other planning commissioners' thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is Ken. I appreciate what Keith and Sandra are saying there. I'm just wondering if we, as planning commissioners, should be trying to second guess some of these decisions that are really going to be done at a city council level. And I'm wondering if we can, to me, these two maps or these two plans kind of are the bookends of the range of what we seem to collectively be comfortable with. And is it possible that we present them as that, like as a minimum map 1 and as a maximum map 2, as best as we can tell by trying to predict how this is going to play out or something to that effect?
So Ken, say more on that, because what if these are really bookends, and I'm not sure if I see that huge of a difference there, but I get your point on, what are we're trying to speculate, and we're trying to create some policy here from a land use perspective that is at the very least not in contrast or doesn't set the city council members or other decision makers up for failure by having sort of this unbridled, where they could be looking at a decision process where they have two businesses that are in very close proximity to each other. And through the application process, they now have to choose between one of those and not both, simply because of a buffer between stores or something that we did. And so I'm with you that the effort isn't to try to second guess or speculate how much they're going to do, but if we can provide some shape to this box, and at least identify some of the elements that they'll be up against, we may not have to decide for them or make it easy, but can we select a process here or a land use application that doesn't set them up for failure? So with that, what if we're looking at these two maps, the one thing that still shows up on those maps, and it's helpful, I'm glad it does, that I think we've talked about before, but let's refresh now that we've nailed down, is the districts. So if we've opened up the buffer areas and we've talked through all the reasons why and how we got to this point, now is there any discussion, or what was our prior discussion and how does it affect where our current shape is at, in regards to, do we start to say, okay, these districts only get so many licenses? For example, if you said you get one license per district, now our buffering areas and all of our land use stuff that we've done is totally sound. The selection process doesn't have a potential for conflict between two of the best users, because the selection process may or may not start with, hey, listen, you can only have one store in each district, as an example, and therefore we've inherently created that buffer between stores, and a selected winner, without having to set folks up for picking on certain elements or some certain reasons that you would select one entity over the other. And then the only areas of conflict that we may still have with that separation of stores is where two districts are, have a shared line. Thoughts on that?
I'd love to hear planning commissioners' thoughts. There's certainly a reason why that has shown up on our maps. I think that from some of the original conversations we had with you all, there may be a preference, like Keith, you just articulated, to look at this more on kind of a district basis. And certainly that is a very feasible way. That's certainly a way other communities look at regulating the number in specific location, or I guess concentration is probably a better term, within a specific area. So I don't think that's off the table by any measure, and would be curious to hear other commissioners' thoughts on that.
This is Ken. Sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
I was just wondering, do we have a map where the districts are outlined that we could see, or if we?
Yeah, are you able to see my screen right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can see there in the background.
Oh,
so
just,
we've
oh,
got
the colors. Okay.
all of
I-
these neighborhood planning areas. Yep,
Okay.
all of those colors assigned
Okay.
to districts. Now, you can divvy it up differently. This is one that we just already use for planning area boundaries. For example, you could choose to do it by city council district or something of that nature. So
Sure. Sure.
ways in
Okay.
which you could slice and dice it differently.
Okay. Let me look at this, and then Keith, I need to kind of think on what you were just talking about. So,
Okay, I'm ready to comment on it, Keith. To me, that's, theoretically a perfectly valid way of doing it, and maybe even preferred, but it really depends on the districts, how you draw the districts, because you could have a big district like the city center one, where there'd be plenty of room to have one on opposites, each of the opposite sides. And you wouldn't have, and they would look and feel and be actually very different, and they'd be very well spaced. So I think you'd have to create district boundaries that that achieve the objectives of avoiding clustering, and also, as much as is possible, created, from a market perspective, attractive places to set up these businesses. So with that caveat, I would support that. You could also probably argue that just setting a distance limit would create the spacing and reasonable, equal marketing opportunities that you're looking for.
Ken, that's spot on. It doesn't matter if we say buffering or create district lines, you still somehow somebody chooses what those district lines are, and spot on. Now, what's shown is our neighborhood planning area. So it's a planning tool that already exists, and we have easy reference to it. With that said, some options to kind of acknowledge that, say, the city center, right? You got the downtown area, you've kind of got the area by Sam's Club and Walmart, and then you've got East North Avenue. So those are three very different areas, for someone who lives in the community. And so now, do you have district lines that start to shape around those to allow stores to be, in that, if you went with a district? Or would another approach, should we subscribe to looking at something like this, would another approach say that, hey, you know what, the policy is that we got 2 stores allowed in the city center neighborhood, 1 in Orchard Mesa, 1 in the Northwest, and 1 in Horizon, and maybe 1 in Fruitvale and Pear Park. It doesn't have to look like that, of course, but as 2 ways of approaching, Ken, what you were indicating, it could be the number of licenses allowed in a district, and as long as it doesn't get too many, then you may have a prudent case for just requiring the buffer between stores, and you're not leaving anybody, hanging with a one guy gets the only good spot in the district, because we maybe look at this and say there are multiple good spots, but I don't know, somewhere in there that gets blurry and messy. But there's 2 approaches that might all speak to what you've brought up, because I think that's a valid point.
I mean, you could combine the 2 things. Like you say, maybe a bigger district that has a higher population could have 2 or maybe even 3 stores, as long as they are separated by a minimum of X feet or something like that.
So jumping in there too. So really all 3 of those thoughts are kind of along the line where my brain is starting to wrap around this. If we had districts, however many, and then the buffering in case there is an overlap of the districts, and of course the schools and everything else will play into that as well. But then maybe the third key to that could be the population. So say, like you say, city center is much larger than maybe, the area that's allowed in Orchard Mesa. So maybe, the three of those combined might be able to come up with one matrix that would speak to where we could have the cap, if it's 6 or 10 or whatever, whatever number we come up with, where they're not on top of each other. It's available to everyone in the valley, but it still doesn't take away the competitive nature for the businesses as well. So that, everyone can spread out enough to be very competitive and be successful. I think, that's of course going to be one of the big keys to making sure we set these businesses up to be successful also. Just a thought.
I think that sounds great, Kim. Maybe you could say for each district, each district has its own minimum and maximum numbers. And in no case, whether it's within a district or from district to district, should there be two stores within X distance between them. And that could give the city, the council, some real guidance on kind of what we think a appropriate total number is, and how they can be distributed equitably without crowding.
When we look at these district lines, those comments and those approaches to kind of help us create those buffers between clustering of stores makes a lot of sense. In introducing that buffer between stores, I'd need to know more about how the selection process would overcome a scenario where you're choosing the two best, or having to choose between two great companies, great operators, great models, simply because of a location buffer. And it may be something that's for somebody else to discuss and figure out. If we had a mechanism to avoid that scenario and accomplish our land use goal of making sure that we've got the appropriate buffers from sensitive sites like schools, and that we also don't want to see clustering, maybe it starts to, with what I'm hearing in this conversation, lend itself to saying these districts that are back there using an existing planning tool of the neighborhood planning areas, that's nice, but it really doesn't apply here. Maybe we have more of a district that's around the, East North Avenue area, the Orchard Mesa area, the downtown area, and potentially the out by the mall, and then everything in between the mall and say Sam's Club kind of area. Maybe that's broken into two, and it starts to lend itself to us creating those districts for the purpose of marijuana retail store, which we're already differentiating between retail stores and cultivation or process and manufacturing. So maybe there's a tool there that tackles all that and still helps us not set up the decision makers for I use the word failure. I don't know if it's failure. It's just a scenario where that selection process, both legally and cognitively, we want to make that clean, and most importantly, we want to make it fair.
Well, I hate to jump in. I think a lot of these are great thoughts. To me, I think there's a tension between how restrictive we want to be with a proposed set of land use regulations and how restrictive the selection process is going to be on the RFP side, assuming that we're using a process like that. If the RFP side is going to be highly restrictive and our council is going to select 6 applications, then we probably want to leave the field much more open from a land use standpoint to locate these things in the best place and to give our city council the maximum opportunities to select the best locations from the RFPs that they're going to get, knowing there's only going to be 6. So the need for buffering and restriction and distances between them and is much less. If on the other hand, we were going to say, no, there's not going to be any numerical limit or any RFP process imposed, like we do with liquor. I mean, liquor sales are unlimited functionally, subject to approval under the applicable regulations and available zoning. Well, in that setting, we'd probably want to be more restrictive about buffering, about zoning where this is an allowed use, and perhaps districting and doing some of these other things in order to facilitate the market coming to us with the projects that we want, and suggesting, I think someone mentioned this earlier, suggesting via the regulation how many of these facilities we think we want to have in town. But if instead of doing it that way, sort of by imposing a regulatory superstructure that inherently limits the number, we're just going to limit the number, then we don't need as much regulatory overlay. At least that's the way it seems to me.
That's really a good point, Andrew, because certainly some of my come from comments have been, hey, let's make sure that we don't let the location be the tail that wags the dog. If we're talking about really the merits of business models and everything else, but perhaps that's a flawed way of thinking on my behalf, that somehow there's going to be operators or business models that are so woefully different that the location is the last thing out there. And in fact, from a community standpoint or from the decision-making standpoint, the location may very well be very important, and it may be on the onus of those applicants to choose a location that does give them more, makes them more attractive in the eyes of the selection process. And in that case, what you just kind of reiterated and helped kind of bring back our previous conversations into this one does land us right back to how this buffer map and the zones that in the green that we've said, these are the places that it can happen. If we know there's a numerical cap, we might then actually be intentionally giving the some weight to the decision makers to pick locations that are spread apart. And now you've got me wishing I would have just kept my mouth shut the whole time this far and up until this point, because I buy it. It's clicking now.
So I really appreciate this conversation. I think this is really the heart of the matter in many ways. If I could perhaps throw a straw man out there, I think what we've heard, one, is that the recommendation at this point is driven by the belief that there will be a numerical cap. And so I think that based on our conversations at the council level, and I think their recent passage of a resolution that expresses such intent, I think that's an assumption that this group has worked from or should be working from, perhaps. So knowing that, I think the conversation is then how, in my mind, maybe the one remainder thing is, it sounds like there's a fair bit of support for looking at this district by district, and whether that's 1 per district or 2 per district, or 4 for city center, for example, that has a really big spatial area and a lot of intense commercial. We can throw a straw man at those numbers that I think generally align with what Kim said, divvy them up by neighborhood, make sure that kind of aligns with maybe the business or the commercial opportunity that also exists within that district. So we can, like I said, do a straw man and give you some ideas and concepts on that one. And then the other one, I think maybe as Keith has alluded, is, there seems to be some desire to create some buffering, and perhaps back to Sandra's original question is, well, what's the intent of the buffering between buildings or between stores? And my mind first jumps to Main Street, right? I think that we've heard, and there's probably some sentiment that you don't want it every store on Main Street. And so, if that is a driver, if there wants to kind of create a framework where Main Street is not going to get a collection of them, for example, then I think we start looking at some of the dimensional components of Main Street. For example, I think blocks are approximately 500 feet long and about 350 feet north to south. So, perhaps looking at that as a way to really define what that kind of minimum buffering is, and perhaps it's 500 feet, just to throw it out there. That would mean that, one per block in the downtown could exist, assuming, they pass the muster through all the other steps of an RFP process. So a couple concepts, and perhaps maybe just a quick summary to a somewhat rambling brief there is, looking at caps per district and a smaller buffer to reflect maybe the Main Street congregation of stores.
Can I just make one final comment? Has it been looked at or considered, instead of between, one store having a buffering? Because I absolutely understand that there's a desire to not have huge clusters, right? But even limiting just say one store for a block in a place like Main Street can be difficult for someone who's trying to locate a store. So what if we say within any area, if you like put a number like 2 stores or 3 stores, then the buffer is now created at 3,000 feet or 5,000 feet. But I don't know that it's necessarily beneficial to say you can't have stores right next door to each other, but I understand that we don't want 5 on the same block. You know what I'm saying? So maybe have some kind of an option within there of saying you can have 2 stores, after 2 stores are located within so many feet, now the next one has to be 3,000 feet away or even further.
I like that concept, and I'd love to hear more about what that wording would be. Because you're spot on. Clustering is the issue. Creating changing the culture and the environment of some, area is what the concern that we're talking about seems to be driven from. And maybe the first question is, do we all agree that, 2 stores in a given area isn't that bad? But, once we get to 3, 4, or 5, then that is. I like that idea. I wonder what that could look like.
I would have some concerns, not personally, but with how the neighboring businesses or other aspects of the neighborhood or people that live around that area might be more sensitive to even like 2 stores together. So I would lean towards just not even, not having any stores within a decent space, apart.
I just feel like that approach, having tried to, start and buy buildings in town to create businesses in, it does get difficult to literally find properties and buildings in this town to create and establish businesses. And I feel like having 2 stores next to each other is honestly better than on Main Street having 1 store on every block or every like 3 or 4 or 5 blocks. Because then you kind of, you have those 2 together, and then the rest of the block has, restaurants and boutiques or the rest of the whole Main Street, But for sure, limit the amount of stores that could be together, and then maybe make the buffering even larger.
And our other tools like our signage, and other elements are gonna help control that. I want to flesh out all these ideas, and so in the effort of kind of throwing against the wall and seeing what sticks, in that scenario, if we could come up with the right language that helped that, we facilitate the difference between looking at all of our zoning in a map like this and saying that all these properties are available, and threshing it and bringing it back down to the reality of they're not all available, and it will be challenging to actually get a site and implement it. If we did something along those lines, it could go a long ways to alleviate a concern about not setting up the those who have to the selection process, not setting that selection process up for having to choose on one given merit, which is how close one great applicant is to another great applicant. It would at least push that issue out to if you had three great applicants right in the middle. So it starts to address some of the things we've talked about. Now the question is does that sentiment of 2 stores in close proximity is okay? Anything more than that is something that we have concern about. How does the rest of the commission feel about that?
I don't have any problem with that. I think that concept is a good one. It's just sort of a tweak on the buffering concepts we've been talking about before. And I like those ideas. I think it's a good concept for how we might provide some flexibility to the creators of these businesses in their locations, so we're not tinkering artificially with the availability of product for the market, but are also preventing the creation of a cluster of these businesses that might otherwise become problematic because they're all together. What I'm struggling with, I think, overall is if the city council is going to do what their resolution suggests and limit the number of locations to 6, then, and there's going to be an overlaying RFP on this, then I don't know that it's very important that we establish buffers. The council RFP process would leave it open. And maybe along the lines that Tamara suggested at the top of our conversation, if you're going to limit this to 6 locations, then we think being more free in the underlying regulations of the land use would be better. But if you're going to put in 25, then we would be thinking about buffering and maybe districting and other sorts of limitations that would try to prevent certain bad things that we might see from a larger number of stores than 6. If it's 6, I mean, I guess I don't feel like that's hugely tragic. And if you put 2 together, even less so. The other 4 are then even further apart. So I don't know, I guess that's what I'm that's what I'm seeing in all of this is, yeah, there's lots of tools we can use. I like using them all, but I think using those makes more sense to me if there's the potential for more stores than we're talking about here.
I agree with Andrew on that.
I agree with Andrew. Sandra, I certainly see your point because we need to be able to allow businesses some flexibility to find space. But Keith, I also see your point too, if there's like 2 together. But I think it goes back to what Andrew's saying. If that there's really only 6, then I don't know that we need to do too much with it versus it being, many more stores. So I wouldn't want to make it too complicated as of yet. So
The only thing I have no problem with what you guys are saying. The only wrinkle I could see is just the uncertainty of the number that the city would cap it on. Remember, the city council that's talking about that now is not going to be the city council that's in place. And when this comes out, so that could completely change. And the other thing that could happen is they could really just be viewing this cap as just a way of not diving in too deep right away and getting overwhelmed. This is just like, okay, well, let's let 5 or 6 stores in, and we'll go through our learning curve and then make decisions later as to whether we want more stores or not, which, it's reasonably likely that that the cap would increase over time. So I don't think we should hang our hats too tightly on the 6 number.
That's a really good point. And it almost starts to beg the question of, okay, we've gone through the last few workshops trying to understand the zoning, the uses, the traffic patterns, the impact on surrounding businesses, whether what buffers from what sensitive sites are important to us. And we've landed here. Now we're finding ourselves really drifting towards trying to sort of speculate as to what the number of the number of stores will be. And then quite frankly, we can draw district lines all day long. And the historical political environment has been that city council, whoever it may be, is going to really have a lot of thoughts and opinion on exactly where it is. So maybe we peel back and start asking ourselves where that line starts to blur between our purview as the Land Use and Planning Commission versus the role of whatever this selection committee, this selection process looks like. And when they put an RFP out, they're going to say things like, hey, we're seeking applications for yada, yada, yada. There'll be this many stores, there'll be this and that. They're going to have some criteria just as the nature of that. And maybe because that's not going to be just a wing ding written up in the legal department without some real thought process or thought sessions from other leadership elements, maybe we pass along our recommendation based on all the zoning and planning considerations that we've already talked about. But we highly emphasize that we are under the impression that there will be a limited number of sites or licenses allocated. And as such, at this time, we are relying on a future process, whether that be the selection process or come back once we know more about your numbers, to then speak to where do these stores go? And maybe we can kind of then give that leadership and ourselves, maybe it's a joint discussion to then come in once it's time to say, all right, we like the number. We understand the zoning and planning elements of it. Now, as a community, really, where do we want these? And how do we go about putting that out in the RFP? So perhaps it's something that we stop speculating and instead we make it very clear in whatever we send forth that these are the appropriate zones and uses based on compatibilities and yada, yada, yada. And we're largely emphasizing, liquor sales on that. But we do rely on further consideration for any desired limitations on where things go, which is the same thing as the number. If it's not under our purview to decide the number of it, then is it's really under our purview to decide the exact location of it. And if we can do that without totally passing the buck and instead giving them a baseline to work with based on sound planning thought, and then invite them to include us, perhaps, to then talk about the number and where when that time comes, because we recognize that there's an impact or a relationship between the selection process and any sort of districting or efforts to not cluster these things together.
Boy, Keith, that was well put. I mean, I really would agree with you as well. Like, I think we're down to the nitty gritty where, like say, how is that RFP going to affect the number of stores or not, and kind of what the process is. So I do think we have some pretty decent recommendations right now on where we think they could go and some thoughts about, two together or not and some other, but without that last piece of the pie, without knowing how they're going to determine how many or where, I agree with you. I think we just need a little more information to finalize what we think on the last bit of it.
I would agree with both of those comments. I've just been concerned the whole time that we're trying to make quantitative decisions without having the data to know what those numbers should be. And I think our recommendations should be more on the qualitative side. What are the areas, the zoned areas and the neighborhoods, the buffered map and just the zoning map where they are appropriate, and then as a starting place, and then say the exact locations and numbers can be entered into this more general map once we hear more from the city council or have a joint session to make those quantitative determinations.
Yeah, Commissioner Scissors, and I think all that previous discussion, I think, is excellent guidance for us. I think, not to backtrack too far, but you guys have made some pretty clear direction on where. And I think perhaps how we capture the remainder of your guys' contemplation and recommendation is really kind of a series of suggestions as to how additional regulations may be contemplated with some specific assumptions. For example, we don't want clustering. Here's some tools that could be used to prevent that. We think that, spacing out throughout the community is, worthy of consideration and want to achieve that. So looking at, for example, at the neighborhood boundaries as a way to implement those specific level of details, I think are all items that we don't have to say exactly what that is, but I think it is probably important to express kind of what the intention that you're trying to achieve is, and then know that there's a variety of tools in which that could be implemented based off of, I think, the other assumptions that we don't have, the exact number, for example, or, the exact selection process.
I think your last comments really summed it up. Until we know more about the selection process and the exact numbers, we're not kicking the can down the road. This isn't an incomplete sending forward. It is here's what we think from a planning and land use standpoint, but it has to be highly influenced by the selection process and the ultimate numbers so that we can avoid our primary concern of clustered stores.
That was really well said, Keith. The only thing I would add to that is the other information we're missing is a little more specific or objective community feedback, because we've tossed around a lot. Well, we've heard from people that they don't want this or that they do want that or whatever. But I would want some reassurance that really is, not just a few loud voices, but that's actually the will of the people. So just adding that piece to what you said, I think, and Tamara said, I think gets us direction to where we could produce something to send back to the council.
I agree with all of that.
Thanks.
So Commissioner Scissors, I just want to make sure I capturing that. I think the essence is essentially that you would like to make sure that there's some kind of public outreach and perhaps even structured as a workshop where this commission or the council directly receives broader input from the community about location or buffering or other issues regarding to location within the city. Is that accurate?
Right, that's correct. So I'm talking about at the next step when we take this more general map and plan and say, okay, let's put some numbers on it. I just want to make sure that when we talk about, well, we've heard this and we've heard that, that it's a more objective process and not just the vocal few.
Yeah, I think procedurally certainly know that it would go through a hearing process. So whether the city also then wants to add additional process to that for outreach or like I said, workshop or taking other public comment, that certainly could be considered as well.
Yeah, and I know ultimately that's not our decision, it's theirs, but we could make that recommendation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to go back. I appreciate all this, and we can certainly pen up kind of a list of considerations, if you will. I want to go back to this slide that hopefully is still up for you guys on kind of that option A or option B, because I think this is the kind of root of the conversation. And I think Keith articulated this earlier, is the location is certainly something I think that you've been asked explicitly to weigh in on, and certainly well within your purview and experience on the zoning element. So I wanted to make sure that we're capturing this accurately. I've heard a fair bit of conversation today about aligning it with a general retail use such as liquor. But I want to make sure that that is the consensus of the group here before I move forward. Seeing general heads nod.
If you move forward with this kind of format, you've got an asterisk there that says assumes numerical cap to be imposed by city council. Should we also add an asterisk that says, I don't know what the right words are, but that speaks to a better understanding of the selection process to ensure, to avoid clustering of more than a couple stores or something? Like, where do we add that kind of language in? Because it's the numerical cap and it's how the selection process goes, right, to determine the where.
Yeah, I think this is not by any measure in final form. I think what we'd outline is an additional set of kind of buffering or considerations. So that spatial buffering between stores, I think, is important. And I also want to make sure that we capture Sandra's sentiment there on the, perhaps there's one or two that are able to locate together, but not a whole bunch of them. And, I think that's good. Are there any other thoughts specifically on this point? And then I want to, perhaps considering time, want to just make sure we have a good wrap on the cultivation and then products, and then come back to signage if we have some remaining time. Chairman Teske, does that sound like an okay approach?
Sure does.
Okay. So let me skip forward here. So hopefully you guys can see this slide as well. So products manufacturing, I believe this captures where we left off last time, was really limiting the locations to an I1 and I2 zone district for any products manufacturing. And I know that there was also some conversation about whether we break that into kind of two levels. One is the actual physical processing versus the food manufacturing. And Keith, you had brought that up. And so we could certainly add that element, is that those that are actually just, doing that food processing or infusing type of thing, they would fall under a different category in our use table. And this is how it would shake out. So you'd have manufacture processing here in this line and foods products manufacturing. That said, you can see they're available in the same districts. I think the predominant thought at the last meeting was limiting to just I1, I2, but I want to make sure that we've captured kind of that option A or option B again here. So.
My recollection, for what it's worth, is that we were leaning more towards regulating it like food products manufacturing than limiting it to I1, I2, again, with a sensitivity towards availability of real estate stock where these businesses might potentially be located. We don't want to be limiting artificially the locations where this otherwise fairly compatible use could be undertaken, and then either taking up I1, I2 zone property with this operation when we maybe don't need to, or causing other problems with the location or siting of these businesses. At least that was my impression, but maybe there are others who remember it differently.
I agree with Andrew. That's what I heard. The other question, will you remind me, is the city council planning on limiting the number of permits for these type of businesses also?
Yeah, that has not been part of their discussion. And I don't know that it was intentionally absent, if you will. I think it was more the focus was actually on retail stores. That is, I think, a much more forward-facing business or publicly facing business than manufactured products. So.
Yeah, having heard that, I agree with where how Andrew summarized what the direction of our last conversation was. And it's possible that the city council is very focused on the retail, and there could be some conflating of the concerns of retail drifting over towards the manufacturing side. My recollection of our earliest discussion, which was at a joint meeting at the stadium, unfortunately, there were only a few city council members, but I thought we had pretty good agreement that, that this manufacturing was probably the best bang for the buck and should be the least controversial. So I would be in favor of, being less restrictive about the locations, and I don't see any reason to restrict the numbers. And just to make sure city council is understanding that difference, I think we should make a point of that.
Yeah, I agree. And to piggyback on really making sure that there's an understanding of what we're talking here. And, my experience in the cannabis industry, I'm watching other towns try to bring it in and the industry try to enter, is really so much of an emphasis on not confusing one conversation with the other. And so that I really support Ken's comments in that regard on our job to, as we pass this forward, make sure that we're reminding each discussion of those differences. And I'll echo it further that, again, we have existing tools that are out there. So when we get into the manufacturing discussion, that easy concern to jump to is, well, what about extraction and what about the use of anything hazardous or flammable? Like, do we really want that in C1? Well, there's already codes in place, being fire codes, building codes, and otherwise, that once you get over certain thresholds that make that a danger, the restrictions on that inherently drive where that's going to occur. And it's either going to be in the rare. I've not encountered a scenario where we have too many, larger operations that would trigger into the hazard class in a C1, C2, B2, simply because you don't have those facilities in order to do that. Right down to everything that's happening inside, as well as in order to be in that classification, you generally have either delivery of those materials coming in, or you need to store them outside, which again has both in our existing land use code, or more importantly in the building and fire codes, restrictive uses that are going to use existing rules to put them in more industrial areas. Or if they do happen in a rare instance in C1, they're done because of all those other rules, they're done in a manner that is very, very low impact. So I think we can really facilitate this conversation by reminding wherever this discussion is happening that, if your mind is jumping right to the, what about extraction or what about this, easy, we've got a hazard class code that takes care of that and addresses all of those concerns. And otherwise, I'm in alignment with Chairman Teskey's recollection and the ensuing comments as well.
Yeah, I would agree with you as well. And I do remember one statement we were pretty comfortable with, that the manufacturing businesses don't really have big, huge signs. They don't tend to have lighted signs. They're pretty much low key and really would be appropriate in any of those zones, as long as, like Keith said, as long as they can meet all of the codes that apply to the manufacturing zones, or wherever they land. It basically would control itself because of the code and because of the the low impact visibility that you generally get.
That's great. Thanks for that summary there. The perhaps one lingering question I had that I'm not sure that we spent time on was actually the buffer, and whether we want to buffer this from schools like we do retail stores. So this is, I pulled up a map on what buffering from a 500 foot would look like. So I just wanted to see if there was any dialogue here.
This is Ken. I can't think of any reason other than sort of a PR type of, more political PR type of reason. As everybody has said, this is it's just manufacturing. There's no big risk to the public. They're not going to be stinky, all that stuff. But if it's important just for the overall purpose of getting a sense of ease and comfort in the community with the marijuana industry here, that might be a decision point, but I think that would be up to the city council. I think from a planning perspective, all the previous comments would indicate if you're going to treat it like everything else, treat it like everything else. And, I feel like we hear from GJEP and the chamber and everyone else that we really want to attract light manufacturing to this community. So I would just hate to see the brakes put on that to what could be a real financial boon.
So I think what I just heard from Commissioner Scissors, and certainly consistent in the previous conversations, is treat this like manufacturing, which would mean no buffers.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with what we were talking about before. The buffering, doesn't seem to be necessary from a land use standpoint.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that before I move on to cultivation? Nope. Great. So cultivation, I believe the conversation was to provide some more limits on it. So I1, I2, I think the conversation was largely focused on absolutely it needs to be indoor only. And I don't know that there was clear resolve on the some of the conversation around whether there's prohibition for locating it inside of some of the more gateway areas or buffering from some certain uses. And what we have gone through, Matt, just for a visual to look at here is I1, I2. So those are the general locations. And this is actually then a buffer of 1,000 feet from schools. So wanted to get your reaction to this and if we've hit this nail or if we need to modify this.
Well, maybe I'll lead this one off too. I got the impression from our earlier conversations that, yeah, we were thinking about limiting this to I1, I2. And one of the things that we noticed from this buffering map, even at 1,000 feet, is it has very little impact on I1, I2 as a zone category. There's just maybe a little corner of a couple of these circles that really hit some properties, maybe in the rail district and a couple other places in that I1, I2. And so again, this should be, at least my understanding of the discussion we had before was this should be treated like other kinds of indoor industrial activity. And, these happen in nondescript buildings. These aren't forward facing, retail operations. They are manufacturing or cultivation facilities. And so, if they're across the highway from a school, no one might even know they're there. And so again, maybe buffering not necessary here, especially with the restriction on appropriate zoning for use as of right.
That's the way I recall it too. So I would agree with those comments. And we should just be really emphatic about strict adherence to the existing ordinances regarding odors and so forth. Just to put a highlight on it, not that it's not already there, because I think that's the main concern there.
Any other thoughts or comments? I think that was a good summation there. All right. So with our remaining time, I'd like to go back to signage since that's where we left off at our last conversation. And so maybe a little bit of a warm up. I think there might have been at least one of you on this planning commission when signage regulations were revised. I think in the last 5 years or so. Jamie could give us the exact date. So signage is generally regulated in a variety of ways. We look at location, we look at sign type, and we look at sign or a size. We don't generally look at content. And I referred to that in our last conversation about the requirements to be content neutral when it comes to signage. That said, the state regulations certainly prohibit that marijuana related businesses advertise to minors, and that's of different ages. So with medical, it's anybody under 18, and for recreational, it's anybody under 21. And the only kind of caveat they put directly in their advertising prohibition, if you will, is that it not limited to cartoon characters. So that's their reference point when they talk about the type of signage that may not be acceptable. So as maybe a little brief tutorial on how we generally regulate signage here is we allow on-premise signs. These are kind of your typical business signs. They can be on a pole, they can be on a monument, they can be mounted to the side of the building. Main Street, they often project. So there's a variety of signs. And we also allow for banners. Most of them are in a temporary nature. So, big sale this weekend or going out of business, that type of business banner. We certainly have allowances for different types of digital faces, electronic face signs. And then we have signage size regulations. So most signage is regulated based off of the size of their frontage of a lot. And it also is scaled differently based off of the size of the travel way that's in front of them or adjacent to them. So for example, you can see here for a 2-lane road, you have less signage allowed than for a 4-lane road. And there's a proportion there that we do a basic calculation, and then signage is limited at 300 square feet. So the conversation, I think, is whether we want to provide any additional or different limitations to signage for this type of use. And I would also want to highlight off-premise signs. So lots of communities actually don't allow off-premise signs. So this is probably a classic billboard, or where you have a certain business at a certain location and they have, signage that occurs, 2 streets down or 3 blocks down. That type of off-premise signage is often not allowed, but we do allow it here in certain zone districts. I believe in our C2, or I1 and I2 zone districts. And those are often seen as billboards in a fairly large scale fashion here in the community. So really want to just open the floor for your initial reaction. Is there a desire or interest to look at additional limitations or regulations to signs for this type of business, or kind of treat them like a normal business? So that's kind of 2 paths to go down here.
Tamara, it would be helpful for me if I had a feel for how other communities handle this issue, if there's really a pretty strong consensus and consistency, or if there's a lot of variability, and if there is, on which issues is there a lot of variability, and which issues is there typically consensus?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have that at hand. And I know, Jamie, you and I talked about a little bit about that yesterday. Do you know have you guys had a chance to pull any regs on that?
Cameron, no, I'm sorry. I wasn't able to. That's why John had offered that Delaney would try and do it for us, but she had court this morning. So I know that she hasn't even had a chance to attempt it. However, I suspect that she's going to work on that for us. Since I'm talking at the moment, I'll go ahead and add. The only other thing that I would point out that I don't think Tamara mentioned is the only real direction we got, and surprisingly, it was included in the Constitution in regards to the approval for the marijuana stuff. And it does indicated that the advertising would be similar to that, which is for alcohol. Exactly what that means, I don't know for sure, but you can keep that in mind when you're thinking about what you think is appropriate or not appropriate. And we will try, and I'll let you know, update you, Tamara, when I've had a chance to see how soon Delane thinks she can get on that.
That sounds good. You know, the one regulation I know we've certainly been tracking is the off-premise sign, and I know City and County of Denver do not allow off-premise signs. So any type of billboard for marijuana-related business sales is not allowed there in City and County of Denver. So that's one. I don't know if that's consistent, but like I said, Commissioner Scissors, it's actually fairly irregular that communities actually do allow off-premise signs. So that is a little bit of an anomaly in our code in and of itself.
You know, after being a part of the sign improvement that we went through and understanding all the content neutrality, and we went through all of these issues and sort of the more nuisance signage scenarios that the city was encountering, at the risk of sounding like it's just jumping on the bandwagon of momentum where we've been elsewhere, I'll actually try to pitch it more as consistency, that we're doing size in the event that the voters approve this business in our community. How does that look? And if the voters approve this business in the community with all of the existing regulatory elements we have specific to signage, this isn't a new innovative scenario. I beg the question of why would we treat this any different? And furthermore, if, as Ms. Beard just mentioned, the state regulatory elements regarding marijuana already has comment of signage that leans it towards what sounds like is a more restrictive set of rules for liquor signage. The first question that we might ask ourselves is, why would we do anything different? And is there a reason? Is it a fear? If so, what are those? And if we can't answer that, I don't see right now. I don't have those answers, and so I would lean towards there's no special signage, not because it's not something that we want to consider or care about, but because again, there are already existing tools and regulatory things on the books that address it.
If I may though, keep in mind when we went and made the changes that we made, and we were focusing mainly on content neutral, that came about because of the case, I believe it's Reed versus Gilbert. And even in that case, it left open that it wasn't necessarily as restrictive when it came to commercial advertisements and or signage. So we still have some ability when it involves commercial signs to be able to do a little more. The difficulty is knowing exactly how far we can go before it becomes a problem. However, as long as we stick with considerations such as time, manner, and place, then that's what other case law has directed that we can be looking at in trying to make that determination. The other thing I keep in mind too, if we want some type of restrictions or we want to go one way or another, if you start now with the restrictions, it's easier to let up on the restrictions than it is not to have the restrictions at all and later wish that you had. It just makes it more difficult to add them later versus starting with them and then alleviating those which you find really are maybe more than they needed to be.
One other thought I have is that signage is just a part of a marketing strategy. What about other parts of it? Radio ads, television spots, mailers, all the other things. Is there language in the constitutional law about that? Or should we even be considering that?
As you're looking at land use, I would say you wouldn't need to consider it. It's not going to be reflective of the changes that you want made to the code. They are considerations that city council may take in regards to some other matters. But for the most part, I would fall back then, I think, more on the direction that the Constitution gave and that treating it similar to then the way that alcohol advertising is allowed and or restricted.
Okay, thanks. That makes good sense.
I would weigh in on that I do feel like in the majority of this process that treating the marijuana sales and different aspects of it similar to the liquor law is really appropriate. And I see that to me, the liquor law for signage really is appropriate as well. And with that little piece, maybe that was Jamie that mentioned where we can add. I know you said it's easier to take away than to add later, but if we kind of don't get too carried away on the restrictions now, it might be a little time of education for us of what maybe the community sees as we move forward and whether they like it or not, or if it's not going to be any more effective than a liquor license advertising, then there's no need to go too crazy, I don't think, in my opinion, on the sign restrictions either.
Are there other thoughts on signage?
I think my thought is mostly about the off-premise aspect of it. I think on-premise signs, I very much agree with the comments that my fellow commissioners have already made about we have existing code for that. I don't see why we should treat this use differently, but off-premise signs, I suppose there's a good question whether we should allow off-premise signs at all, but certainly for this use, I could imagine there being some concern from the community that, we don't want billboards all over town advertising the pot shop. It just makes it a little bit more prominent in the community. I'm not sure that's entirely rational, but nonetheless, it does seem like a potential thing we might want to consider by way of regulation of signage is just outdoor advertising or billboard advertising related to these businesses off premise.
How does off site signage, how's that dealt with alcohol and other 21 plus uses?
To be honest, I'd have to check to be certain, but I'd say based on experience, you don't see a whole lot of alcohol signs that are posted on billboards specific to particular types of liquor. However, I do believe that I have before seen some in relation to beer. So I would have to check that and get back with you. Sorry, I didn't check it beforehand.
No, that's fine. If maybe we should understand what those are, and if those have reasonable restrictions on the off-site, we can just stick to our basic premise that it should be dealt with like other 21 plus restricted businesses.
What's interesting is the state had originally said no off-premise signs. The state has backed off and is now allowing them. I just hadn't had a chance to look into what all the discussions were as to that particular change. So I'll also try and get that for you to bring back at the next discussion.
If I wave the small business owner banner on this one, and I'm now a marijuana store, how are you differentiating between me and my niche store and a brewery, a local brewery, or a winery, or a distillery? I think we need to be really, again, cautious for all the reasons that have led us down the road of treating this just like a liquor sales and other over 21 elements before we go adding everything on. And from a procedural, I'm compelled to say this, from a procedural standpoint, and I'm totally in Jamie's corner, that it is easier to back down off of, over regulating than it is to add on. But from a from a business perspective and a community perspective, I'd rather the government not come in and over-regulate with the idea that they might peel back later. And that's a sentiment that I think goes beyond just my own in this community.
Any other thoughts? So hearing none, I can pause longer if I need to. What I would recommend we do is I will work with Lance and we will author up essentially a summary of, I think, where we're at on retail marijuana products and cultivation, and send out a draft for you guys to review, and we will talk about it and comb through it perhaps one last time at our next workshop. And it sounds like we've got at least one minor to do here, which is to make sure we circle back on signage, especially the off-premise signage, and understanding the liquor license. So we'll certainly keep that as a to-do. There may be a couple other, hopefully relatively minor pieces to look for your input on as well, but we'll try to get those out to you in advance so you can be thinking through them. One that kind of comes to mind is hours of operation. It's just making sure we get some good direction on that one, and we will comb back through and see if there's any other pieces there that we want to make sure you've had an opportunity to weigh in on before we package it up for council.
Tamara, the other one that we didn't get to that was in Lance's report had to do with whether medical and recreational should be required to be, I think he said, co-located, if I remember the language, or not. So we're out of time now, but I do want to make sure we get to that one.
Yeah, I have that on the list of questions here as well, and that plays a little bit into the kind of the administrative burden just for licensing, but certainly we'll make sure we comb through these other questions for you all, and you can decide on whether you want to weigh in or not on some of them. So with that, Chairman Teske, I did want to
Can I make a comment before we leave that topic? Because Ken brings up a really good element that we spent a significant portion of our discussion talking about how or if there should be consideration towards separation and buffering between stores. And I would start to ask the question of, from a visual perspective and from an impact perspective, what's the difference of having a medical marijuana store and a retail marijuana store? So I think Ken is right to bring up that topic, and that it maybe has a little bit more weight in the rest of our conversation based on what I heard us all talking about here today.
Yeah. Commissioner Ehlers, I certainly think we will talk about it. We can spend as much time as we need on it. I think from our perspective, we think it's actually hopefully a quick and relatively simple conversation. One about whether we want to look at this for both retail and medical, and if so, are they really essentially one store located in the same building on the same property, for example. Well, that sounds good. I did want to just remind those that have interest in doing a tour. When Lance gets back early next week, we will send out the logistics for where you all are headed and times for a meeting place and kind of expectations for that tour. So I do know that those will be coming into your inbox, like I said, early next week. And then we will have a workshop 2 weeks from today. And we will get through as much of this as we can, and potentially even wrap it up should we be able to come through those remaining elements at that point in time. I will say that the target for us is a March 1st for City Council. So the City Council has a workshop on the 1st where they would like to comb through essentially the body of a regulatory scheme. Everything obviously doesn't have to be fully fleshed out based off of today's conversation. There'll certainly be areas of consideration versus a direct recommendation, but that is certainly the target. City Council has invited your chairman to participate in that conversation as well. And he, I trust, will represent this conversation or these conversations well for you all. So, Chairman Teske, that's all I have for you today, unless you've got something else for me.
I do not. Thank you, Tamara, as always, for a great meeting, and thanks to everyone else for your participation as well.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for some great input, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.